Hello, I'm Bruce DePoit. Coming up today on News Talk, crime is up locally, and so is the use of synthetic drugs. Is there a link? Our first guest has crunched the numbers. We'll ask him what he found. WAMU 88.5 reporter Patrick Madden standing by with a look at the question everyone at D.C. City Hall is asking. Then, are you confused by all the claims and counterclaims about the agreement the U.S. and other nations struck with Iran? It turns out there's an app for that. We'll talk with Professor Steve Cull of the University of Maryland.
From WJLA, this is News Talk with Bruce DePoit.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. Great to have you with us today. It's been a rough summer for law enforcement locally and around the nation. Violent crime here and around the nation up, and officials seem to be grasping for a cause. The uptick in violence coincides with the spike in synthetic drug use, but is there a link? WAMU 88.5 reporter Patrick Madden has spent some time crunching the numbers and joins us now. Welcome back. It's good to have you here.
Thank you.
You did a fairly deep dive into what has been a challenging summer for law enforcement around the region.
Yeah, so right now in D.C., there's been about a 25% increase in homicides right now and over last year. And like you said, police are trying to find out why. In fact, the police chief met with police chiefs from around the country to sort of figure out what's going on. So one of the things they're looking at is this question of whether the rise in these synthetic drugs or synthetic cannabinoids, as experts like to call them, if that's the link. So one of the things I did is I actually looked at all of the homicide arrests from this year to try to see, you know, is this something that you can see in the arrest records? So far, I mean, I found one case where there was a link, where it mentioned in the arrest record synthetic drugs. But other than that, I haven't seen anything else in these specific arrest records. Now, again, it's early, more arrests. I mean, not all these homicides have been closed, so there are a lot of arrest records out there. Another thing with these synthetic drugs is that they're hard to test for. So they're constantly changing. The chemistry is constantly evolving, because each time someone puts a ban on this drug, the chemists tweak the formula, create a new drug. So it's actually really hard to test for these drugs. So the bottom line is we just don't know. It's hard to test for them. From what I've looked at, the homicide arrest records so far, I found one case.
So you say it's early, and to a certain extent it is. It's too soon to be drawing really hard and fast conclusions, but we're 7.5 months into the year. There are murders out there for you to look at, and for you to find one, I think a lot of folks listening to us now will find a little startling, and it will undercut any notion of a link.
It could, but again, a lot of lawmakers around here, council member, the mayor, they've said, yes, this is one of the big reasons. It's really just hard to say. I mean, I'm just looking at these things. It's hard to say if there's a link. I can tell you that I haven't found it looking at the arrest records so far. The police union put out a statement along the same line saying this is a red herring for lawmakers and the police to be pointing to synthetic drugs as the cause of the uptick in crime. But the police have also pointed to other things. I can talk about that too, but just high-capacity magazines on the guns that they're finding on the streets. This question of really a small group of repeat offenders that are causing most of this violent crime that they're seeing. So it's not just synthetic drugs. They're talking about other issues, but this is one that really has captured, I think, the imagination here in D.C. You've seen, you know, big stories in the Washington Post and other things about this new problem with the drugs.
When Chief Lanier and her counterpart, the head of police in Chicago, talked to reporters and talked to CNN after or during their big city chiefs summit not that long ago, it was clear they didn't have a single reason, a single thing they could point to that would be that could fairly and accurately be described as the cause for the crime we're seeing. They left open the possibility that there is a link with this drug use that we're seeing, this rapidly changing drug that produces this very unpredictable, by all accounts, sort of a high. And they did touch on what you just referenced, the notion that it's these repeat offenders, and it sounded as though they were sending a message to the judiciary to be somewhat stern and tough on these people, because they are there's potentially a small universe of people contributing to the crime that we're seeing.
Right. So it was interesting when they talked about it. The police chiefs came out and held a press conference, and they said, we're behind sentencing reform. And that was pretty remarkable for the police chiefs, this tough-on-crime crowd, to say, we believe that, for low-level, nonviolent offenders to go through diversion programs to get them out of the jails, because there's this cycle of recidivism that's hard to break, right? But at the same time, they said, as we push for these reforms, we need to make sure that we're being tough on these small group of repeat violent offenders, folks that have, gun crimes and other things on their record, that we don't want. The police are saying they don't want these folks to be let out if we do sentencing reform.
To the extent that you were able to probe the homicides that have taken place in D.C., how much of that is available, and how much of that did you have to sort of FOIA? Talk from a journalistic perspective, if you would, about the research you've been doing.
Right. So the process really is going down to the courthouse and printing up the court records from homicide cases as they've come out, usually through the police release information and press releases and other things. So I'm sort of creating a database, putting the names in there, where these murders are happening, who's involved. I mean, when I put them all into a database, 35 of the 87 homicides took place in southeast D.C. So really, it's in certain neighborhoods where this is really becoming a problem, and you're not seeing in other parts of the city. So it's one thing I think that police are trying to get a handle on. But again, I would come back to this issue of guns. It just seems that there was a homicide on July 4th where there were 50 to 60 shell casings that were found on the ground. So there are a lot of guns on the street, and when police talk about these high-capacity magazines, guns that carry a lot of bullets, they say that's when you have collateral damage, bystanders getting shot.
D.C. first allowed medical marijuana. Then it was decriminalization, and now we're even beyond that. We're much more akin to some of the states in the West, Colorado, Washington State, in the marijuana legalization area. Do you think the arrival of synthetic drugs at a time when we were supposedly entering a new era in terms of traditional weed, do you think, is it possible that police and law enforcement have been caught by surprise by all this? It
seems like it. I mean, I spoke with this guy named Dr. Eric Wish at University of Maryland, who's sort of an expert on synthetic marijuana, and he was saying that they saw a similar issue in Colorado when they legalized marijuana. They saw synthetic cannabinoids sort of popping up on the street. So no one really knows. It doesn't make sense on its face why, once you've legalized marijuana, you'd have this synthetic marijuana suddenly become a big issue. But from my understanding, it's because it's really cheap and it's easy to get. We know that the D.C. Council's really gone after retailers by cracking down on the folks who sell this stuff, and I guess it's always going to be out there. And you're seeing it outside homeless shelters. The U.S. Attorney's Office is now actually doing an outreach campaign at homeless shelters, telling people about these drugs. So it seems like they're playing catch-up, and again, it gets down to this is a different drug because it's constantly evolving and it's hard to test for, and they don't know what's in it, and that's part of the problem.
And the behavior it triggers in users, the accounts we're getting, the descriptions we're getting are pretty wild, and they're pretty unsettling. I mean, this is something that folks would be well advised to stay away from.
Right. They don't know what's in it. The chemicals keep changing, and you're hearing about a lot of overdoses, a lot of sort of erratic behavior. But again, is that causing the homicides in D.C.? I mean, that's where I think the link is hard to prove.
This is a challenging moment for a chief and for a leadership team that have that are highly regarded and that have been in place during a time when the broad perception is, and I think the numbers bear it out, Washington and the region are safer than they used to be. So we're sort of watching Kathy Lanier struggle to get a handle on why this is happening, and of course getting a sense of the causation, if you will. You would think that would be totally essential to coming up with a strategy to put in place to counteract it.
Yeah, I mean, for years the homicide rate was dropping, and that was something that the police and politicians in D.C. really took credit for. So now when you see the opposite happening, people are really trying to figure out what's going on. So that's why we're seeing all these different theories out there about what's causing it. And I guess police are really trying to be proactive about this and trying to say what's going on.
Can you talk again about the numbers? How many homicides have there been in D.C. this year, and how many do they consider closed?
From last week, it was 87.
87 total.
Yeah. Closure rate, it's a little unclear, but I read one story about it's not anywhere near where it used to be. So police are having a harder time solving these crimes. But again, it's kind of apples and oranges comparing closure rate at this point, because it's usually done at the end of the year. But there are open homicide cases, and when I looked at how many murders were taking place, in Southeast D.C., it was about 35, and about half total if you looked at both Northeast and Southeast. So these problems are happening in really specific parts of D.C.
And in recent years past, we've gotten to December, and the question was, would the number of homicides for the year remain under 100? It's kind of a psychological goal or whatever. I mean, the goal was zero. The goal is zero. But I remember December's where we were in the 90s. Here we are in early August, and we're close to 90.
Yeah, right. I mean, right now we're on pace for, you'd have to go back to 2008. That's how big the increase in homicides has been this year versus the previous several years.
Patrick Madden covers City Hall and D.C. generally for WAMU 88.5 FM. Always good having you here. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Bruce.
Bring us an update as you have it.
I will.
Good to see you, and we'll take a break. We'll come back with more News Talk right after this.